So, what's your name and any affiliation, if any?
I'm Radhika Desai, and I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, and I also am part of the board of the Friends of Socialist China.
Wonderful. So, just for some context for people who may not have heard of it, what is the Manifesto Group?
The Manifesto Group is a international group that is essentially tries to create a greater publicity for socialist and anti-imperialist causes. So we hold regular webinars, and we have actually a manifesto which you're welcome to read at www.internationalmanifesto.org. And in general, like for example, we are doing a webinar on the 80-year anniversary next Sunday, and we have we similarly do things on what's happening with China, on multipolarity, on what the West is doing right now and how misguided it is and stuff like that. So,
Wonderful.
yeah.
And you mentioned the Socialist Friends of China there. That's a separate grouping.
Friends of Socialist China.
Friends of Socialist China.
Yeah, it's a website. Again, you can just, I think the website is www.socialistchina.org. So you can find them there, and and if that's not the right one, just Google Friends of Socialist China. They every week they put up several new interesting items about what's interesting to know about what's going on in China and so on and so forth. So it's a very important group.
Regarding China, there's currently obviously a drive. There's an atmosphere, you could say, of suppression against China and any kind of positive relationship with it. Where do you suppose that is coming from in the West?
Well, to put it very briefly, the West was friendly towards China as long as it thought that China would remain a subordinated economy, happy to produce cheap toys and cheap footwear and whatever. But the moment the West began to realize that China was not satisfied with remaining subordinated, that China was committed to developing its own economy, and indeed, more than that, was successful at developing its own economy, the West has been getting more and more wary. So actually going back to the early part of this century, George Bush Jr. imposed steel and aluminium tariffs on China. Then you got Obama's pivot to Asia. Then, of course, you got Trump and his anti-China antics. And then Biden's essentially continued all that. And we are now in Trump Mark II. So, it's had a long history. And like I said, the friendship was basically conditional on the assumption that China would remain subordinated. And as they realized that China won't be, we have seen an increasing commitment to containing China, to reversing its rise. And yeah, so and at the end, it's not necessarily new. They actually behaved in a similar manner to the Soviet Union as well. So yeah,
Is that too? Yeah. You mentioned about how they're not going to be a subordinate power. They're going to be ascendant and have more of a say in international affairs. There's a lot of I don't know if the correct term would be this, but I'd say fear mongering amongst Western press about the consequences of this. Do you think people in the West have much to fear from this development?
Not at all. Essentially what we ordinary people in the West who like our governments to be more accountable to us rather than big corporations, I think what we have to realize is a very simple fact. What our governments and the sort of captive media, the media that simply parrot what our governments say, what they find objectionable about countries like China or even Venezuela or Cuba, all of whom they call dictatorships. The reason they are called dictatorships is because these countries have refused economic subordination to the West and have insisted that they have the right to develop their economies in any way they want. But because because the only way to develop an economy is to not follow Western prescriptions, is to reject Western prescriptions and develop your economy based on fairly substantial state intervention, state support, etc., which is necessary, then the West and the West, of course, reserves the right to give state support and so on to its favorite corporations, as you see. But the moment the West sees that there is a country it would like to subordinate, but is actually standing up to them, they call it authoritarian. So, in fact, there is nothing to fear. In fact, I think what we need in the West is we need to assert our rights to say, we need more state intervention to protect workers' rights, to advance workers' rights, to make our economies more productive. Right now, we are living under a wave of financialization that does not invest productively, and it will require government regulation to ensure that finance is not going towards speculation and predatory lending, but is moving towards productive investment, which is what we need. And I don't mean by that, just production for its own sake. Of course, we have to have sustainable production, but all of those things, quite frankly, I mean, I don't know what we are doing these days about the environment. Anyway, our governments are doing. So I think we need a government that is for the people, for for the people and the planet, and not for profits. So this is what we need. And I think if we were to get such a government, we would not look so different from China or Venezuela, etc., whom our governments are today calling authoritarian. We would also have governments committed to a productive economy, which is also organized on an egalitarian basis.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And regarding, like you mentioned before, the governmental principles having to be adapted to a more state-like model, what do you suppose is driving the financialization in our economy compared with somewhere like China, where they do maintain a strong hand?
Well, I think what's driving it is that, people say that neoliberalism is about markets and competition. It never has been. It has always been about giving more and more power to big corporations. But giving more and more power to big monopoly corporations is not going to bring, not going to bring out competition. It's going to bring out the worst in them. Because when you have really big corporations, either you nationalize them or you heavily regulate them. Giving them more and more power simply means that they make a lot of profit, but they do not invest it. For a number of reasons, many of them have to do with the neoliberal paradigm. For example, demand conditions are awful. And why wouldn't they be awful if you are constantly putting money into a smaller and smaller number of pockets and taking it away from ordinary people? It's not going to create great demand conditions. So productive investment remains low. So then what do these people do with their profits? They put it in financial investments, which lead to speculation and predatory lending rather than productive investment, which is what we need.
Wonderful. And so this event today has been to commemorate 80 years since the end of World War II. We seem to be on a new drive towards war with Russia, perhaps even with China. What do you suppose is causing that drive in the West? It's be it the media or government itself, or perhaps even business.
Well, honestly, the Western drive to war is not very rational, because if you think about the last even 50 years, recently we also celebrated 50 years of the end of the Vietnam War. How did it end? Not very well for the West. The West has a long, it spends a lot of money on its military. The United States, we are told, spends close to $1 trillion, maybe more, according to some estimates, every year on the military. What does it get for it? A military that is actually not able to win any wars. So I don't think we're well advised to go to war. So then, so there is no rational explanation. So what are the irrational explanations? The irrational explanations are, number one, we have a big military-industrial complex that benefits from creating a warlike atmosphere. Definitely, there is no doubt that that's part of what's happening. But there's also this absurd desire on the part of at least elements of our leadership, perhaps all of our leadership, that think that somehow they can win militarily where they are losing economically. And they're not going to get it. But
why do you suppose it is that is their attitude?
Because they are capitalists and imperialism is a central part of capitalism. They cannot stand that other countries they wish to subordinate can be economically successful, but they are economically successful.
Right, I see. And
in fact, right now, China is more economically successful on practically every measure than the West is. So
And the event today, how did you find the event overall?
I thought it is very important because, and I found it very informative. I thought many of the speeches were fantastic. In fact, I think all of the speeches were fantastic. But I thought, the representative of the the Russian ambassador spoke very well and movingly, as did the gentleman from Belarusia. Keith gave a fantastic speech. Shanaz gave a great speech. I think they were all fantastic speeches, and it's important to go to these events because, as the mainstream media is trying to suppress the truth about the past. And when you start suppressing the truth about the past, there is no doubt at the end of the day who cares about the past. It's because they wish to distort the future in some fashion. And I think that's what's happening, because the reason for distorting the truth about the past is because they want everybody to line up behind their proxy war against Russia. I think that that's why people should come. Is that people? I think most people are actually not taken in. I mean, most people know that they're not being told the truth, but they perhaps don't know where to turn. Naturally, working people have limited time, but I think that, so understanding that if you can, seek out alternative sources, that would be great, because it's important to know the truth about these things, and it's actually not hard to find on the internet. But as I say, if you're a working person who's working 8-10 hours a day plus commutes, etc., who would have the time? But anyway, such events are important. Because they do provide in within a couple of hours some really good information. So.
Yeah. And if you had one last message to give to the public, should they see this anything, be it a appeal or a message, what would it be?
Well, I guess at this point in time today, when we are commemorating the 80th anniversary, I would say that what I find most distressing is the way in which the history of the war against fascism is being distorted by people who are supporting new versions of fascism today, whether it is in Ukraine or even sometimes in our own countries. So, as you know, generally speaking, Europe is and the Western countries generally are suffering from the rise of the far right, which has definitely got some fascistic elements. Plus, we are supporting a government in Ukraine and a war in Ukraine which has enlisted support of fascist currents. And I think that this, like our ancestors who fought against this war will be spinning in their graves to think that, we are now being asked to swallow the idea that somehow these fascists are freedom fighters, that our parliaments are, as several speakers noted, our parliaments, like the Canadian Parliament, are inviting fascists into their midst and applauding them. I mean, it's just astonishing to me that there are hundreds of members of parliament in Canada. Not one of them had the intelligence, the guts to stand up and say, well, wait a minute, if he was fighting, this man who was applauded, Mr. Hunka, if he was fighting against the Russians in the Second World War, who was he fighting with? That was a very elementary question that somebody should have asked. And so I'm appalled to say nobody asked it.
Thank you so much, Radhika.